all the gold was never uh, uh, um, claimed at one time. So they started issuing, they could get rid of some of the gold, and they could issue receipts on gold they didn't have. And, so that's the way banking started. It was a bunch of crooks. It always has been. The first bank, the first modern central bank, the Bank of England, was started by perhaps the greatest embezzler of all time, Mayer Amschel Rothschild. He got the money to start all that he was an embezzler, an incredible embezzler, So she says the problem with gold coins was that they could not expand to meet the needs of trade. The revolutionary advance of medieval bankers was that they succeeded in creating a flexible money supply. It was a crime, one that could keep pace with a vigorously expanding mercantile trade. They did this through the use of credit, quote, credit, okay, something they created by allowing overdrafts in the accounts of their depositors. What do you mean allowing overdrafts? They were making them. They were issuing them as evidence of their own wealth. Okay. Okay. Under what came to be called fractional reserve banking, which is the crime, okay, the bankers, and it's inevitable to interest. There's no way that if money is backed by gold that you can't resort to a fractional reserve banking policy inevitably, because you have to issue more and more and more money in order to sustain a vital circulation. So, there's no way that gold can back all the debt, the further debt that you have to issue just to maintain a vital circulation. The bankers would issue paper receipts called banknotes for more gold than they actually had. Well, no kidding. Today, paper money is no longer redeemable in gold, but money is still perceived as a, quote, thing, unquote, that has to, quote, be there, unquote, before credit can be advanced. Banks still engage. Here she is. It's like she's writing this from a perspective of a person who's accepted the idea that banks have to issue credit. I'm sorry. That's the whole problem. They've intervened upon this process. They're not true issuers of credit at all. We are, okay? And they're just there to print evidence of our promissory obligations to each other, and to launder the principal into their own possession, and to multiply the original debt into terminal debt by interest. That's the whole scheme right there, okay? She says banks still engage in money creation by advancing bank credit, which becomes a deposit in the borrower's account, which becomes checkbook money. This is trivial, neophyte. In order for their outgoing checks to clear, however, the banks have to borrow from a pool of money deposited by their customers. If they don't have enough deposits, they have to borrow from the money market or other banks. Well, that's not true either, because the obfuscation is to borrow from the central bank to make it look like money has to be borrowed into circulation. The peripheral banks comply with the obfuscation to be part of the scheme, and they just get a menial amount, a margin of interest, on all the interest, which is charged for merely publishing our own promissory obligations together to each other. So there you have her explanation of it, which is just doesn't account for Shinola. There's nothing in there for you that helps you. And yet this woman is going to author a new kind of currency. She doesn't recognize the one that I authored so long ago. Why is that? Why is that? And this person is going to present a solution to Iceland? Woo. She goes on, as British author Anne Pettifor observes, the banking system has failed in its primary purpose, to act as a machine for lending into the real economy. Well, it hasn't failed in that primary purpose. And it isn't lending money, it's merely publishing our promissory obligations. And she's quoting this person as if this counts for something, okay? She goes on, instead the banking system has been turned on its head and become a borrowing machine. No, the peripheral banks are, because we have to borrow all that. Okay, and the government has, because it's got to reflate the circulation, because we've exceeded our creditworthiness and we can't maintain a vital circulation any longer. Okay, now the government, corrupt as it is, isn't doing that because it's an ingenious way of continuing the crime. It first exceeded its authority. It was doing all the wrong things. It's in breach of representation, and it tread down the path of crime. And now that it's escalated its spending to these preposterous degrees, it just happens that that's what's keeping us afloat. And the only solution is fixing both the government and the economy. And there's one way to do that. And that is mathematically perfected economy and absolute consensual representation. So, she goes on to say that the banks suck up cheap money and return it as more expensive money. You're delirious. This is literally idiotic. If they return it at all, she says. The banks suck up cheap money and return it as more expensive money, if they return it at all. Who are they returning it to? The banks control the money spigots and can deny credit to small players who wind up defaulting on their loans, allowing the big players with access to cheap credit to buy up the underlying assets very cheaply. Okay. The first part I think she probably stole from me in an explanation of how the banks, created all the chaos to, create the public, error of believing that, we needed banking regulation when the regulation actually consolidated the very inimical banks, which were the cause of all this. She goes on. Securitization, monetizing loans not with gold but with homes. Ooh. Getting to sound more like Mike Montagne every day, isn't she? She can't explain this stuff for the crap, but she'll copy me, without reservation. Monetizing loans, not with gold, but with homes. Jesus criminy. I've been telling about this $100,000 house thing for 40 years, and here she is. Whew. What we need is a new concept of money. And here, she can't explain how all this stuff works, really. She hasn't even accounted for this obfuscation of the currency, and she is yet plagiarizing me. The money markets are part of the shadow banking system, where large institutional investors park their funds. The shadow banking system allows banks to get around the capital and reserve requirements now imposed on depository institutions by moving loans off their books. Large institutional investors use the shadow banking system because the conventional banking system guarantees deposits only up to $250,000. And large institutions, this is so boring, I can't even believe it. And that's the argument for a new currency? You got to be kidding me. You got to be kidding me. You get rid of banking, which he just continues to want to preserve, which is the problem, and you don't have any of these problems, and what is she trying to do? Convince somebody that she knows something or something? How is any of this even relevant? It's ridiculous. Like with the gold that was lent many times over in the 17th century, on purpose, not as an innovation. The same home may be pledged as security for several different investor groups at the same time. This is all done. Now, she's going right back to this same system then, Okay, let's start with the next paragraph. As in the 17th century, however, the scheme has run into trouble when more than one investor group has tried to foreclose at the same time. Okay, that might happen. But the scheme runs into trouble because irreversible multiplication of this artificial indebtedness, which she's not even addressing here, in her need to create a new money, okay? Because that multiplies initial artificial indebtedness into terminal artificial indebtedness. That's why the scheme collapses, okay? And she herself is advocating eradication of interest now. She can't even argue with that anymore. And yet, this confusion. She says, and the security model has now crashed against the hard rock of hundreds of years of state real estate law, which has certain requirements that banks have not met and cannot meet. course not. They can't meet these things in the end because they can only exceed them to an ever greater degree as we descend into terminal failure. And cannot meet if they are to comply with the tax laws for mortgage-backed securities. Okay. More irrelevance. The bankers have engaged in what amounts to a massive fraud. No kidding. Not necessarily because they started out with criminal intent. Oh, come on! You know, they come between the real debtor and the real creditor and say, oh, no, you can't issue your own promissory obligations on your paper. You have to issue them on ours, and we launder all the principal into our possession. We don't retire from circulation. It enriches us to that degree, and then we multiply that into terminal indebtedness by interest. And somebody intended to do that for a beneficial purpose? What possible beneficial purpose could exist? There isn't even a beneficial power. The only power is to defraud us into complete dispossession. You know? And this woman is going to create a new money that's going to serve us only by copying, and little by little, after everything that she's done wrong is corrected. You know, next week's article or whatever. Go ahead, Ellen. Tell us. You know, this is a indelible record of her own ineptitude, you know, and inability to deliver these solutions. She's just conning us into thinking that she's got a solution here, so that you keep listening to her and you keep buying her stupid book, which never gave you a solution and never will. You know, you already had the solution. She's trying to take it away from you for her own benefit. She goes on, the public credit solution. The flaws in the current scheme are now being exposed in the major media. Well, sure. You know, I write Glenn Beck about, you know, mathematically perfected economy at many people's insistence, and I know people that are writing him several times a day, even presently. And the next thing you know, Glenn Beck is quoting Benjamin Franklin from my pages, words of Mike Montagne, you know. And Thomas Jefferson, which also comes from a disputed quote, which is all over the internet now, which academia has, you know, informed me. Jefferson never said that. If the American people ever allow the banks, you know, the words weren't even used at the time, you know. But I'm the one who's preserved that quote because it teaches, you know. And so Glenn Beck's doing this, and now all this is being exposed in the major media. Why? Because those guys understood all this all of a sudden. Without me? Don't think so. Can Glenn Beck deliver you the solution? I don't think so. Ellen Hodgson Brown isn't. Glenn Beck isn't. Stephen Zarlinga didn't. Bill Stills hasn't. None of them have. Not Dove of Oneness or Nassara or Farm Aid. You know, sorry. You know, Farm Aid could solve its problems by talking to me. How? Because under mathematically perfected economy, what's happening to the farmers? They're being dispossessed from their land. They're squeezed out from all different directions, okay? So farms are becoming incorporated in this country, and they have been for decades. This is a long existent problem that I've argued one solution for all this time as well. And how would mathematically perfected economy solve the issues of the farmers? Very simple. Dairy farmers, okay? You know, 2 years ago on the Farm Aid program, and I watched that when Wilco performed, you know, fabulous performance by Wilco, and I watched the whole thing. Well, you know, they transitioned over to, you know, a dairy farmer situation, and you know, the price of, I think it was called 100 weight was the unit of milk that they discussed, had descended from, you know, the low $20 to $12 or something like that, and it was still going down. And while that was happening, the middlemen were making record profits. Okay? Now, what are the middlemen doing? Well, they're trucking the milk away, processing it, packaging it, and delivering it to market. Okay? Well, here's the thing. These farmers are on the verge of bankruptcy, so they can't compete with the middleman. Why can the middleman compete with them in this way, to an omnipotent way? Because they're at the favor of this huge financial system which loves to control things like this. Because it's a money-making machine. It's a